This is Business Edge on News Central. I'm Mtwalo Msoni. Our headline story: review of South Africa's 2021 budget as announced by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. There were a bit of emotions and some anxiety, but we'll get into the details after this. Again, this is Business Edge. Welcome. Anticipation and many other emotions were probably running wild among South Africans before the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni read out the 2021 budget proposal. Much of that emotion turned to relief when he announced that the South African government will not increase the personal income tax. That decision comes at a cost. The Rainbow Nation will miss out on about $3 billion over the next 4 years. And now the South African Treasury will pay for the COVID-19 vaccination. He also mentioned that there would be a 1 percentage point cut in corporate tax from April 2022. He told the parliament that we are allocating more than 10 billion rand for the purchase and delivery of vaccines over the next 2 years. A further 9 billion rand could be drawn from contingency reserves and emergency allocations if needed, as the final costs remain uncertain for the vaccines. However, the minister cautioned that the rollout was likely to gather pace only in the second half of the year. Hence, the threats of further waves of infection continue to cloud the Treasury's forecast on key indicators. It is predicted that the country will experience real economic growth of 3.3% in the current year, off the low base of last year's historic lockdown shrinkage, followed by 1.9% in the outer years. The ministry took a decision to reverse its earlier announcements of additional tax measures that would have raised about 40 billion rand amid a revenue shortfall. In order to make up for some of the revenue lost by the now cancelled income tax increases, the government will jack up taxes on tobacco products and hard liquor. After an estimated 7.2% GDP contraction last year, the prospects of cultivating growth depend on the success of economic stimulus measures and the country's COVID-19 vaccine rollout, as well as to the extent to which it allows a full reopening of the economy. This news has helped send the South African rand to its highest levels since January 2020. The rand strengthened as much as 1% versus the dollar. Now joining me on Business Edge is Mtwalo Msoni. He's an economist, researcher, and global tax advisor for Action Aid. He's joining us from Lusaka, Zambia. Mtwalo, good to see you again. Welcome to Business Edge. All right, let's get straight into it because I can hear you now and I'm very sure you can hear me. So as it's been said, two things in life are certain: death and taxes. But for South Africans, they're able to breathe a sigh of relief right now because for now, their personal income tax will not be increased. Many believe that this was a decision between raising more money for the country or South Africans having more money in their pockets and more money to spend. So how do you think it was the issue of South Africans having more money that won out versus raising more money for the economy?
First of all, I think it's important to mention, if you look at the expectations that we had, seeing what was projected to be spent over the midterm, we thought that there would be tax increases. But of course, now we know that there hasn't been any tax increase, especially for personal income tax, which is good news for most citizens of South Africa. But the burden of tax seems to be shifted to the poor because excise duties on tobacco, on alcohol consumption have been introduced, and these are generally regressive because they affect the poor, the less well-to-do, the vulnerable, more than they affect the rich. There's also talk about some duties and some taxes on fuel. If there's an increase in the price of fuel, this is likely to affect the less well-to-do in society as well. But in essence, generally on the tax front for individuals, I think it lifts the burden off from individuals on the amount that they're supposed to pay. And corporate income tax as well has been reduced, which is not a very progressive move because companies only pay corporate income tax, first of all, if they are making profit. So a reduction from 28 to 27% might not have been the wisest move, seeing that the country needs to generate much more revenues for it to be able to finance its COVID vaccination program and for it to be able to maintain stability that will ensure the 3.3 economic growth that has been projected for this particular year.
Okay, so let's talk about a few things that the minister actually announced. So he announced that the personal income tax, as you said, the brackets would actually be increased by 5%, which is more than inflation. According to him, this would provide about 2.2 billion rand in tax relief, and most of that relief will reduce the tax burden on the lower and middle income households. So the first question would be, what would be the knockdown effect of this on the economy in terms of making sure that lower income households have a bit more cash in their pockets? But then if you're looking at the flip side, when you mentioned the excise duties and how increase in taxes on cigarettes, alcohol, things like that tend to affect the poor more, where then is the middle point in that regard?
So there has been a shift of the tax burden for lower income households, at least for the ones that consume tobacco and alcohol products. So while there will be a shift in terms of their burden for personal income, they will be bearing that burden when they purchase these particular goods because they'll be purchased at a higher rate. Of course, the implication of having a tax on consumption might be less than the tax on income because consumption patterns can change and you can change your consumption bucket. But in essence, the burden has just been shifted from one end to another. And we do know that the country still needs to raise the much needed revenue. So we might see an increase eventually come through in the next coming years because there are projections of increase in growth over the years, and this growth will, of course, need to be financed. The infrastructure development projects that have been talked about in the budget will need to be financed and revenue needs to be raised. The budget hints on the fact that South Africa has moved to up to 80.2% in terms of their debt to GDP ratio from a 65% which was recorded last year. This is an increase of 15%, quite significant considering that they're expecting the debt to GDP ratio to only stagnate in 2024 at an 88%, 8% compared to 15% in just one particular year. So eventually someone will have to step up and pay back the interest on the debt. Currently, as presented in the budget, 1 in every 5 rands that is being spent in South Africa is being spent on interest payment on debt. If you're going to spend 1 rand as a government, 21 cents of that is going towards interest servicing. So eventually, I think in the absence of increased tax compliance, which at least created an environment where SARS collected more revenue than anticipated, we might need to see some tax increases somewhere in the absence of very good compliance amongst the taxpayers and an efficient tax system with the administrative capacity to collect the revenue.
Okay, I just very quickly want to ask, because this excise conversation is quite an interesting one. So if you're raising the taxes on these goods, not necessarily considered luxury items, how much do you think South Africa can really raise? Because we heard the minister tell the parliament that South Africa is not swimming in cash. In fact, the country is deeper in debt than many people actually realize. So in terms of raising the taxes on these goods that are coming in, do you think it can really, of course, it won't solve all problems, but can it take a considerable chunk out of what South Africa is looking for?
Yes, the revenue potential to be raised from alcohol consumption and cigarette smoking consumption is quite high, and we can project and see how high it is by the fact that South Africa lost out of considerable revenue last year because of bans in terms of the purchase of alcohol. An 8% excise duty has got the potential to raise lots of revenue, considering that alcohol and cigarettes are generally goods with very little substitutes. They are complementary goods. The two are complementary goods with very little substitutes. So it's very unlikely that if someone has a craving for alcohol consumption, they would instead go buy juice. So this definitely means that there'll be very little that will shy away from buying alcohol products, and it will generally not reduce the demand as much as it would reduce for a good which has perfect substitutes, or at least can be easily substituted. So there'll be considerable revenue. The only problem with such an excise tax is that the burden falls more on the less well-to-do households, because it's 8% whether you do have the resources to purchase the alcohol, or 8% whether you do not have the resources to purchase alcohol. It's as regressive as value-added tax, because regardless of your income bracket, regardless of how much you have to spend on your basic needs basket, you still bear that increase in terms of the amount that you spend.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the ways that South Africa might be looking to raise money, and there'll be some more later on. But I have to ask now, if taxes are off the table, particularly in terms of increasing personal income tax, but taxes on for certain goods, what other options does South Africa have? What other options is the country left with in order to raise money towards its economic recovery? Away from loans, because we'll get into that conversation about loans in a bit. But away from loans, what options are there?
Away from loans, there's an opportunity of an increase in revenue collection coming out of improved administrative capacity and tax compliance. It's very difficult for corporations, for individuals to comply with tax, especially if it's very high and the burden is highly felt, because they would want to shy away to save more revenue for their day-to-day needs and so on and so forth. But improved tax compliance is actually what has led to South Africa not increasing the personal income tax as it is. The improved tax compliance comes as a result of an increase in administrative capacity to make use of existing data, to analyze aspects of tax incidents, understanding where the burden falls, understanding who's who, and where tax is supposed to come from, why it's not coming from there, and what we need to do to ensure that people pay more. Automation is one area where South Africa has made very good advances, and it would be very good if we can see South Africa being one of the countries in Africa that's spearheading the use of increased information, automatic exchange of information, for example, some little advances in country-by-country reports, and to see how it can curb loopholes for base erosion, profit shifting, improving tax compliance as well by ensuring that there are stringent measures that are put in place for corporations, for companies that would want to avoid tax. Audits of the cost of operation will be very important as the country seeks to improve its revenue collection without increasing tax, because of course cost is a function of profit, and if we're going to collect that 27% corporate tax, it's important to know the actual cost of operations. And when we understand the actual cost of operations and notice that they're base eroding payments, it will be important to also probe this, see if we can revise some double tax agreements on the payment of management fees, interest payments, and so on and so forth, and see how we can also contribute generally to the debate on digital taxation.
Okay, all right. So before we go for a break, something else that the finance minister mentioned during his budget speech was the possibility of a loan. Now to that loan conversation, a loan from the BRICS Bank. South Africa's national debt stands at over $210 billion. We've seen many African countries are now being forced to take more loans because of COVID's impact on their economies. Do you think that a loan from BRICS is a very, very high possibility for South Africa?
A loan from BRICS is a very, very high possibility, and of course it would ease, it would put an ease on government expenditure needs and government's targets for revenue collection in case they underperform, because they would have the resources to pump into the economy, to pay wages and so on and so forth. But the thing is that it should be mentioned that we're already looking at a country with an 80.2% of GDP to debt ratio, which is only looking at increasing it by 8% in the next 3 years. an increase of 15% in 1 year. If the country continues to accumulate debt, in the short term, it might seem as if they'll be able to meet their financing needs as it is, and there'll be stability, as we saw the rand gaining value just when the budget was announced. But in the long term, this 1 rand on interest payment for every 5 rands that's spent by government might turn into 2 rands being paid for interest on debt for every 5 rands. This would further reduce the spending that the South African government has on essential sectors such as health, such as the social sector, of which we've seen a cut in expenditure for 10 years. It's not a very good news for the poor. There has been a slight increase, but this increase is less than the inflation rate. So in real terms, it basically means that there's been a reduction in the amount allocated and the value of the resources allocated to spending towards the poor.
Okay.
Increase in debt accumulation would further reduce the position on this as well.
All right, Mtwalo, let's take a break because there are 2 areas we must touch on before we leave, and that was the unemployment report for South Africa that dropped just a day before the budget speech, and also something interesting enough, SAA and Eskom, unlike previous years, were not front and center of this budget speech. What does that mean for these 2 state-owned entities? Business Edge will continue after this. This is still Business Edge right here on News Central. My guest is still with me. Mtwalo, let's look at what really wasn't so prominent on the finance minister's speech. Now, the budget includes almost 20 billion rand for the purchase and delivery of vaccines in the midterm. But also, unlike previous years, Eskom and SAA were not front and center. However, the Treasury did announce that SAA's business rescue practitioners requested for 3.4 billion rand, but that request is being interrogated. So in terms of, we understand that it's a COVID year. This is a budget coming out of the COVID pandemic, but not hearing so much about Eskom and SAA. Are there any assumptions we can make because of this lack of prominence of these 2 children of South Africa that have really been a drain? Let's be very honest. There have been a massive drain on finances.
Well, Eskom has a case. There's lots of power demand. The power deficit really warrants that might be worth getting a bailout, might be worth getting extra resources. South African Airways case is also based on the fact that there's been a reduction in the demand for flights with the coronavirus pandemic, and it will be important for SAA to position itself post the pandemic period to be the airline of choice to see increased businesses and possibly see some profitability. We haven't seen that yet. Of course, these cases do need interrogation because these are public resources that are going in to fund entities that haven't been profitable and have been a huge drain on resources. The exemption that has been made in terms of receiving resources is the land bank. The land bank is mentioned, but which will receive a bailout of about 9 billion rands over the next 3 years. So with interrogation of these other 2 cases, who knows, we might see potentially more bailout because they have cases that they can present, and we've seen government actually having a soft spot for bailing out some of these entities. Interestingly, emphasis was placed on the land bank this time around.
All right, so let's get to the vaccine conversation as well. So the the Minister of Finance, I want to call him Budget Minister, said that South Africans would not have to pay for it, that the Treasury will find a way, that 10 billion rand, almost 10 billion rand is being set aside, an additional 9 billion in terms of contingency and also coming from possible emergency funds. But he warned that the total cost is not very clear now because of how it's moving and the potential for more outbreaks. Where will the Treasury find the money? Can you just give us an explanation? These contingency accounts, these emergency accounts, where does the money in them come from? Does it still not, in a way, come from the general public?
To some extent, it comes from the general public. To another extent, it comes from probably higher performing grants, higher performing loans. We already talk about potential loans from the BRICS Bank. Setting up the contingency fund and increasing its amount is quite important in this case, considering that currently, as it is, the nation does not know the performance, at least does not know how exactly COVID vaccines will be performing after the rollout, how the nation will perform after COVID vaccines, if everyone will be reached, or if a new strain of the virus will require another sort of vaccine. So I think this emergency fund, contingency fund increase is quite important. And it's one of the lessons that countries have learned over time, that we need to have this contingency fund in place in places where we're hit by the pandemic, like we had seen most of the countries going to recession last year because they didn't have the resources to respond to unforeseen circumstances like this one.
All right, finally, Mtwalo, before I let you go, just before the minister's finance speech the day before, we heard numbers, very, very alarming numbers coming out of South Africa. 7.2 million. The jobless rate in South Africa grew to 7.2 million South Africans. Unfortunately, this was a record, and not the kind of record any country would want to have. In terms of the speech that we heard, any references to this, to dealing with the unemployment crisis? Because at 7.2 million South Africans, it is now a crisis. So any regards in terms of Treasury or the Finance Ministry working to address the unemployment rate?
An extra 11 billion rands about is expected to go into the job creation programs, and this time around is expected to create just over 5,000 jobs. That's a drop in the ocean, considering the number of people who are unemployed and where the unemployed people actually lie, which is amongst the poorest of South Africans. It's a drop in the ocean, but then at least there has been talk about an increased efforts in trying to create jobs, which is a very big problem for the country as it is, and probably would see this area improving as the country seeks to grow, considering that there's a projection of 3% growth in GDP. And there's also talk about more spending on infrastructure to make manufacturing and trade sectors pick up as strategic sectors post the COVID pandemic.
All right, Mtwalo Msoni, thank you so much for joining me, economist, researcher, and global tax advisor as well. Very much appreciate your time, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
All right. So before we wrap things up, let's give you a bit of the stories we're keeping our eyes on, and very appropriate. We start in South Africa, where the country's treasury has confirmed that it is looking to make retirement and tax changes for people who immigrate from South Africa. The proposed changes relate to the cashing out of retirement savings when leaving the country and when specific taxes are applied. The international oil benchmark Brent crude rose further on Wednesday to $67 per barrel compared to Nigeria's budget benchmark of $40 per barrel. Now, for the country, which relies on crude oil for about 50% of government revenues and over 90% of export earnings, rising oil prices means increased revenue. On the contrary, rising oil prices also translates to an increased cost of petroleum products, as the country depends heavily on imports due to a lack of domestic refining. East Africa's trade balance improved in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, with lower imports as Kenya's manufactured products and demand for Tanzanian minerals held up their economies. According to a report by the United Nations Economic for Africa and Trademark East Africa recently released, Kenya registered an increase in exports of manufactured products, especially non-food, industrial supplies and machinery, as well as other capital equipment, while demand for Tanzanian gold increased by 33.6% between January and November. And finally, following a statement issued by the airline on Tuesday, Rwanda Air, the flag carrier of Rwanda, will become the first African airline to incorporate the IATA Travel Pass program into its operations on a trial basis. Developed as an initiative to restore passenger and government confidence towards the reopening of state borders, the Travel Pass is an application that enables the ease of verification of passengers' compliance with COVID-19 testing and vaccine travel requirements through a secure digital platform. That's it on this edition of Business Edge. Thank you for watching. I'm Tolu Lokwe Adeleru Balogun.